afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining us. We are excited today for a discussion about a fascinating and fun new book, Whatever Happened to the Vital Center, written by two of our very own, the Miller Center's Sid Milkis, as well as Nick Jacobs, who is a professor at Colby College, but who was a student of Sid's and a part of our Charlottesville community for many years. And it's great to have them both with us. They've written a probing dive into the evolution of American politics, populism, and constitutional principles, with a focus on the increased populist fracturing from the 1960s onward. But before we begin, just a few words on each of Sid and Nick and their fellow panelists today. Sid is a distinguished professor of politics at the university and the White Burkitt Miller Professor at the Miller Center. He focuses on the American presidency, having written the most important textbook on the American presidency, co-authored with Mike Nelson. He writes on political parties and elections, social movements, and American political development. He's a highly sought after speaker and prolific author, and of course, one of our very best colleagues at the Miller Center. So Sid, thank you for being here, not just today, but being here all the time. It's so great to have you with us today.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Nick's an assistant professor of government at Colby College, where he researches the historical development of the American presidency, presidentialism, wow, that's a mouthful, and federalism. Before his time at Colby, Nick was a star student of Sid's here at UVA, and so it's really great to have you back, Nick, and great to have you, and we can't wait to have you physically here with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation.
And we're really delighted to be joined today by Ron Christie and Molly Reynolds, two terrific political scientists, political analysts, and one practitioner who will speak with and to Sid and Nick's work. Ron is a Miller Center practitioner fellow, communications executive, and a former assistant to both President George W. Bush and Vice President Dick Cheney. He's also worked on Capitol Hill and has written 3 fantastic books on American politics, Black leadership, and the Black American experience. Molly is a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution, former colleague of mine, with a focus on Congress and the impact of congressional rules on policy and political outcomes. She's authored a book to this effect, exploring the budget reconciliation process, among other procedures, and has several research projects underway concerning congressional oversight, congressional reform, and budgeting. So thank you both, Ron and Molly, for joining us today and being part of the conversation. Since we're deep in the middle of football season and into basketball season, although we only have 2 halves in college basketball, I'm going to divide today's conversation into 4 quarters. The first quarter is going to be a conversation with Sid and Nick about the book. Then I'm going to bring Molly and Ron into the conversation for their comments and thoughts. We're then going to have a question. The third period is going to be a conversation among our 4 panelists. And in the 4th period, we're going to turn it over to you, the audience. But throughout, I really encourage you to send in your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And to the extent that they affect the first, second, third quarters, we'll also try to incorporate them in the conversation. So without further ado, let's get started with Sid and Nick. And I'm going to kick off by just starting with the phrase, the vital center. Where does that phrase come from?
You want to start, Nick?
Sure.
It may have started before Nick was born, but Nick, I'd love your take on it.
He's very well educated, though.
It might have Sid beat by I won't say how many years, but most directly, it is the title of a 1949 book by Arthur Schlesinger Jr., a famed historian of the 20th century, and also the archetype Democrat, progressive insider. I remember one time I was in the archives looking at old National Review articles, and the National Review used to fundraise off this guy, saying, do you want him running your country? Images of Schlesinger and his bow tie. But in this book, The Vital Center, Schlesinger doesn't really act like the partisan. He acts the scholar. He acts the scholar at a time when America's coming off of World War II, the kind of zenith of American exceptionalism. And he wants to know what's going wrong in the country? Why is it that the Democratic Party is silent on issues of racial justice? Why is it that the conservative Republican Party seems to have abandoned its commitments to civil libertarian principles, such as freedom of speech? And, I'll admit it, we sort of started reading this in the aftermath of the 2016 presidential election, also trying to understand, what are scholars missing? What have we gotten wrong? And what we notice is that while Schlesinger presents this beautiful defense of American principles, something that progressives and conservatives can kind of coalesce around, he almost takes for granted the political institutions of his time. And so by saying what happened to the Vital Center, we're trying to understand how the sort of post-World War II consensus that Schlesinger writes about, that brought in conservatives and liberals alike into this sort of project of American self-government, how the institutions that supported it have changed since that time. Sid, you want to add anything?
No, I think that's good summary.
So, Nick, in your summary, and to Sid too, you mentioned a bunch of different things that, let's say, fall under the category of norms and values. A consensus seems to speak to the way people think about the world, talk about the world, share ideas, and engage with one another. And then institutions. And often when we think of, I worked at the Brookings Institution for 10 years. We were very careful about saying institution. If an application came in saying, I'd like to work at the Brookings Institute, it went right in the trash. But institutions convey long-standing and often bricks and mortar. Give us a sense of some of these values and some of these institutions that supported the Vital Center. Maybe I'll start with you, Sid.
Yeah.
Talk about some institutions here. What's the bricks and mortar?
Well, Schlesinger is talking about the commitment, the consensual commitment to post-World War II liberalism, which was an anti-communist liberalism. And the two pillars of this New Deal state that he saw as so central to the well-being of the United States were the welfare state and the national security state. And as Nick said, even though he felt there was a vital center in place, he was worried about challenges from the left and the right that would not only challenge the institutions of the New Deal state, but also the liberal norms and institutions that state was compatible with. And he was worried about authoritarian challenges on the right, but also very concerned about insurgent challenges from the left. Remember, this was written in 1949, embodied by Henry Wallace's campaign on the left, which Schlesinger felt was too sympathetic to communism, to totalitarianism, as he put it. So he not only feared that the New Deal state was the kind of pragmatism that allowed for a consensus in American politics was being challenged, but the challenges were threatening the liberal norms and institutions that the New Deal state was they complemented and sustained the New Deal state. The New Deal was not a radical reform that departed from the Constitution, Schlesinger argued. These were reforms that strengthened constitutional norms for the time. The Great Depression and World War II created reforms that made the Constitution more supportive of individual freedom, given the changes that American politics experienced in the 30s and 40s.
And that braiding between norms and institutions is best summarized in that word that I also trip over, presidentialism, which is not even used until the 1930s, until the New Deal institutionalizes this idea that a central figure should be the repository of the public responsibility, should take leadership in this New Deal state. So if there is an institution that is most central to our argument and to our historical tracing, it is the growth and the transformation of the American presidency.
Which is not just the president you're telling, particularly you're telling, Sid, since this is a topic you've been writing about for some time, which is how you and Nick got together on this topic to expand upon it. What you call executive-centered partisanship is not simply the president acting in a more partisan way. So maybe as a way of guiding this, I've thought a little bit about a speed round here. So I've got 4 different institutions, and I just want you to give us you can pick your scale, 1 to 5, cold to hot, chili pepper hot if you want, how these institutions have contributed. So Congress.
Chili pepper hot. Congress has contributed by being, if I can put it this way, complicit in the strengthening of the presidency. After a big part of the New Deal is the delegation of congressional power to the presidency, and Congress forfeiting some of its most critical constitutional powers, the right to declare war, its power over the budget. Now, it does put in place some constraints. Oh, you wanted this to be rapid fire, so I'll just say this quickly. It does put in some constraints. I think an act that was a very important part of Congress of preventing legislative side, I think, as Theodore Lowy puts it, was the Legislative Reorganization Act of 1946, which set up a strong oversight committee system to provide, as the law almost puts it in biblical terms, Bill, continual watchfulness over the executive. So in a way, Congress and the executive shift responsibilities here from the original Constitution. The president becomes the first mover, Congress becomes the overseer of that activity.
How about political parties?
Nick, we'll alternate.
It's tough to know whether political parties as institutions in their own right, separate organizations, which is almost sort of hard to even keep in our minds now since it's undergone such a transformation since this New Deal consensus, whether they're a contributor or a victim of presidentialism. Certainly the parties themselves, especially in the late 1960s, in the aftermath of the 1968 Democratic National Convention, in the aftermath of Watergate, once Republicans realized that they can actually have congressional majorities if they're a little bit more responsive to an activist base, the parties themselves adopt the rule changes which recenter power away from a Washington establishment and towards a base, what we would call a base, which is sort of an amorphous term that describes people that are just really passionate and interested about politics and may be very unlike the average American. So they adopt the rule changes, but in the process, they become hollowed out institutions. They become somewhat meaningless as organizations that can exert independent constraint on the presidency, on members of Congress, on state governors. You know, we have strong partisanship. We really identify as Democrats and Republicans, but we don't have strong Democratic and Republican parties anymore.
I see Ron shaking his head. I'll tell a funny story there. In the summer of 2015, toward the end of the summer, I happened to have a dinner with Vice President Cheney. I think I can tell the story now. For years, I didn't want to name him publicly, but someone at the dinner said to him, "Mr. Vice President, the Republican Party is going to name Donald Trump as your nominee next year," which nobody thought would happen except for this guy. And the guy said to the former vice president, "When is the leaders of the Republican Party going to stand up and stop him?" To which Vice President Cheney replied, "Can you tell me who are the leaders of the Republican Party?" So one last one, which are, who are these populist organizations and who are these populists that have turned over the apple cart?
Well, there have been.
First of all, where are they on the scale of 1 to 5? Are they chili pepper hot? Or
I forgot about the scale. I think all these are chili pepper hot 5. Throughout the 20th century, Bill, there have been insurgencies challenging the party system. And the destination of those challenges occurred in the 1960s. And out of the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement emerged these tremendously important reforms. And people talk about them, but I don't think they recognize how the chili pepper hotness of them. And these were the reforms, of course, that remade the presidential selection process and took power away from the party regulars and established this kind of media-driven plebiscitary system of caucuses and of open caucuses and direct primaries. As a result of these changes, power shifted from party regulars as leaders that Vice President Cheney was looking for to social activists, interest groups, and donors who disdain the party establishment and the compromises that party establishment is willing to make, compromises that were thought necessary to form a majority coalition. And although these reforms are defended as participatory democracy, it's not clear that they strengthen majoritarian politics in the United States, because power becomes very centered in the primary voters, where there's low turnouts. And as Nick was describing, these are the bases of the party that really eschew make it very difficult to form the kind of majority coalitions that parties had been central to forming from the beginning of the 19th century to the 1960s.
I'll just quickly.
Yeah, please, Nick.
That populism and these populist movements are not new. We trace, and my apologies for the very long chapter too, because it just kept coming up. We trace several populist movements from the very beginning. You could argue that the Constitution itself is a reaction to a populist revolt in Western Massachusetts over issues of Revolutionary War debts. Anti-Masonry is foundational to the establishment of what we have come to know as the two-party system, a response to this populist revolt in the Burnt Over district in New York. And then, of course, there's the big capital letter populist movement of agrarian protest at the end of the 1800s. So it's not that populism, or that we're not in a populist moment. It's that what used to temper populism, what used to channel it, respond to it, but what we might say respond to it responsibly, those institutions have undergone a dramatic transformation.
So I'd like to bring Molly and Ron into the conversation. Molly, I'm going to turn to you because we've touched particularly on Congress, which you know so well. And I should say, Molly and I think last saw each other in person as we were preparing for what ended up becoming the Trump presidency. We talked to a number of former legislative affairs directors. And I'm curious, from that time in what was probably late summer of 2016 till now, almost 5.5, 6 years later, is it getting worse? Has populism taken over Congress? Is Congress as dysfunctional as Sid and Nick think, or is it even worse than that?
I feel like you're channeling our colleague Tom Mann, Bill, in asking, is it even worse than it looks? The book that he wrote with Norm Ornstein. So I think on this question of populism in Congress, and Nick and Sid get into this a little bit in the book when they take up particularly the aftermath of the Republican Revolution in 1994, and this degree to which I think members of Congress now feel the same pressures that they document elsewhere in the book as being felt by the presidency. I think one of the, to sort of kind of zoom out a little bit and go back to something Sid was saying earlier when he responded to your question about how much is Congress to blame. I think Congress is certainly to blame for part of this. Certainly the part about how much sort of the growth of the administrative state and the growth of the administrative powers of the presidency, which is, as I follow their compelling argument in the book, there's sort of two necessary conditions here for what we've gotten. It's the more powerful administrative presidency and the populism that we were just talking about. And so I think Congress is certainly to blame for this administrative powers piece. Some of it is purposeful delegation by Congress. Some of that purposeful delegation is because Congress is simply not well equipped to make the kinds of choices that the modern administrative state needs. Some of it is a political choice by Congress. They simply do not, that members simply do not want to be bothered with the kinds of choices that the administrative state makes. Some of the expansion of administrative and presidential power is an assertion by the executive branch without adequate response from Congress. Sid mentioned the Legislative Reorganization Act. We have a couple other examples from the 20th century. Obviously, I do a lot of work on the budget process. So we see the Congressional Budget Act of 1974. So some exceptions to this trend, but certainly lots of instances where the executive branch is asserting power and Congress is not well equipped to respond. And then simply there's some inevitable slippage in a more complicated world where the executive branch is responsible for more things and Congress simply can't keep up. But I think there's also a kind of reinforcing element of presidency-centered politics, where it gets harder for Congress to act as a counterweight as the presidency expands its power, and more it is harder for members of Congress to see themselves as institutional actors the more powerful the president becomes. And then the last thing that I'll kind of note on this is that I think Congress has a particular version of, so in the introduction to Sid and Nick's book, they talk about kind of the hollow parties problem, or another way I've heard this described that I associate with the political scientist Julia Azari is weak parties and strong partisanship. And Congress has a particular version of this problem where we have this high partisanship and weak institutional parties. Who's the Republican Party that we're talking about, to use your Vice President Cheney example? Those are kind of outside the chamber, but then we also have everything inside of Congress organized along partisan lines and so much power in the hands of party leaders. So to some degree, this is at the wishes of individual members of Congress, especially in the context of, say, negotiations over legislation. There are things that individual members would prefer someone else have to deal with, so they kind of run it up the flagpole, and it becomes the problem of party leaders. But it creates this environment where it's very difficult for individual members to exercise power outside of partisan channels, inside the legislature, which creates sort of a separate, though related set of institutional challenges to the ones that Nick and Sid have described in the case of the presidency.
So, Ron, bringing you in on that point, Nick and Sid talk about the populism and the anti-establishment voices within both parties. They want to run against the status quo. The right status quo wants to reduce the administrative state. The left status quo, the right populists want to, what was the Steve Bannon phrase? Deconstruct the administrative state. The left populists want to add to it and expand upon it, build back better and beyond, right? 4Bs. Do they get this right? Are the parties as bad and irresponsible as they call for responsible parties? Therefore, the parties have become irresponsible. Are the parties as bad as Nick and Sid say they are?
I think it's even worse. You know, I go back to my time on Capitol Hill, right? I spent almost all the 1990s on Capitol Hill. And I just remember showing up in 1991 and being in the minority and thinking how terrible it is to be in the minority. and then listening to the Republican minority leadership saying, boy, if we get back in there, it's going to be payback, and it's going to be payback, and we're going to make Pelosi and those guys pay for what they've done for us for keeping us in the wilderness. And I look at the point of where the sort of devolution of the strength of the political party movement is. And I think you look to the 92 and 96 presidential elections, right? You have soft money violations, you have problems on both sides of the ledger. And I think people in Congress sort of looked at that and said, well, why do we have to listen to a Haley Barbour, or why do we have to listen to the party elders anymore? We're kind of on our own. We can sort of take the reins here and have our own populist movement. And I fast forward that to the 2016 election. And I will never forget being in Manchester, New Hampshire. I'm a co-founder of NoLabels.org. And I remember we did an event up there, and it was almost like watching 5-year-old kids playing soccer, where you had one soccer ball and every kid hovered around the soccer ball. And the soccer ball was Donald Trump. And you look at the Marco Rubios, and you look at the Jeb Bushes, and you look at the establishment, and you could just see that Republican, Democrat, Independent, that there was no appetite anymore for the establishment in that particular climate. And they wanted someone who was more of a flamethrower. And my experience on the campaign trail was that there were so many similarities between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren on the left and Trump on the right. It's that we don't trust any of you in Washington anymore. We don't believe anything you say anymore. And we want a different voice, a different perspective, and the heck with all of you. And it was fascinating to watch it up close.
Mm-hmm. To Molly and Ron, before turning it back and bringing Sid and Nick into the conversation, to play it out, let's just say people across the spectrum have had some real grounds for frustration. In the last 50 years, the failure of 2 wars, Vietnam and the Iraq invasion in 2004, 2005 that went on for a long time. Even during Obamacare, the promise of, during the Obama administration, the promise of the Affordable Care Act and the crashing of the website, the response to the pandemic, and now 1 year into the Biden administration, almost doubling of the number of fatalities over the course of the Biden year on top of the Trump year. Are Americans wrong in being angry?
Molly?
Yes. So there's lots to be angry about. I think one of the great challenges.
I forgot the financial crisis in 2008, not to mention the economic impacts of the pandemic.
Absolutely. I think one of the great challenges of our sort of system of government is the sort of disconnect between the promises that are made during campaign seasons and then the capacity of parties, particularly in a legislature, which continues for most legislation in the Senate to have a supermajority requirement to actually deliver on those promises. So I think one of the, in addition to sort of anger about the objective circumstances, I think there's also a lot of frustration, sort of perpetual disappointment, a sense that Americans are told repeatedly by politicians who are running for office that they will be able to, that they will, do certain things when they are elected. If we have divided party government, the party that controls some parts of the of Washington will say, if only we had unified government, we would be able to do X, Y, and Z. And then the realities of both divisions between the parties in a legislature that does have a supermajority requirement for most things in the Senate, and within the parties, both in the House and the Senate, just makes converting on those promises quite difficult. And so I think as we kind of think towards the future, and I obviously spend a lot of my time thinking about sort of the future of the Senate filibuster, but this is one place where I think one of the great questions is, eliminating the filibuster would make some difference. There are things that are not being done now that might be done if the filibuster were eliminated, but there are lots of things that I think still would have difficulty moving through the legislature and onto the president's desk. And so I think that and that's what I'd say, Bill, in response to your "should Americans be angry?" Yes, there's lots to be angry about, and then there's this frustration about the inability of our governing institutions to deliver on their promises.
Ron, let me throw that same question at you, but in a slightly more pointed way. Do Americans on each side have a reason to be angry at the other side?
Yes, and I think that gets to the premise of what happens to the vital center, right? When I showed up on Capitol Hill, my boss, former Congressman and former Governor John Kasich, wouldn't introduce legislation unless he had a Democrat as a co-sponsor, right? He wouldn't go into this process without reaching out. And I think people look at their representatives and say, do you even talk to a Democrat during the day? Do you even talk to a Republican during the day? Do you find ways to forge compromise, or do you just do what you think that the populist sort of voices of your party tell you to do? Not us, not your constituents, but what you believe that base to be. And I think there's a reason for people on the left and the right to be very upset that it seems so base driven in our politics these days about, wait a second, what about the 700 and some odd thousand constituents that these representatives are elected to represent, and these two senators from these respective states? Are their constituents' voices being heard, or is it the populists? And so, yeah, I think there's a good reason for people on both sides of the spectrum to be angry at the other.
Mm-hmm. I want to bring Sid and Nick back into this. Coming out of that, I do think of one or two instances where presidents have pushed back against the urges in their own party to simply deliver red meat for the base and try to reach out to broader things. But I'm wondering, is that sustainable, or is that the way forward? You guys put a lot of book in asking for the parties to act more responsibly. Don't at some level presidents have to lead if the problem is presidentialism? Being responsible for delivering for the parties? Can't the president start this process by saying enough is enough?
Well, they could. They're, to a point, Biden has made an effort to do that, particularly in the beginning of his first year. But I think, Bill, that this executive-centered partisanship is really deeply rooted in our democracy, and there's very powerful incentives that work against presidents exercising forbearance. Everything encourages presidents to pursue their ambition. And so I think presidentialism can't be solved by presidents. I think one of the real, I think a little bit of anger is really healthy, and party conflict is really healthy because it shows the American people are not apathetic. And as Tocqueville pointed out when he came to America, in a country that's so dominated by individualism, the most dangerous disease is not anger or polarization, but it's apathy. So the anger in itself, I think, is not the deepest problem. I think the way the anger is expressed, which is that the president has to expand the causes of the base without constraint, and the opposition, that the president has to be stopped at all costs. I think that's a really destructive system that presidents can't solve. It's a really interesting situation where the whole country loves the presidency, but half the country hates the president. Mm-hmm. And Nick maybe could talk a little bit about some of our ideas of some things that might temper this presidentialism that certainly look beyond expecting presidents themselves to solve it.
Well, going back to this larger question of what is the role of the president in curbing presidentialism, you'll have to forgive me, but even the great leader Odysseus, to navigate around the sirens, needed constraints, right? Needed to be held back. And I think ultimately that's what we argue, is that you have to give presidents a little help. And that help can come through constraint and the constraint of parties. I think the most enjoyable example that I had in writing was about Franklin Roosevelt, the transcendent leader, so we usually think, in his debates and his efforts to wrestle with the populist movement that was unleashed by Father Coughlin. If Franklin Roosevelt didn't have party, if he didn't have partisans that could go and run against Coughlin's people, if he didn't have members in Congress willing to push back on Franklin Roosevelt, on his agenda, if he didn't have, he wasn't an all-powerful leader, if he didn't have that support system, I don't know if we would have seen the transcendent Roosevelt-type leadership that we've all come to sort of admire as what a president could accomplish. He was a president in a non-hollowed out party system, which is what made him great.
Mm-hmm. All right, so we are into the third quarter here, and I'm going to turn to our let's call them our slot backs of Molly and Ron to pepper some questions back to our quarterback and running back here. So Molly, I'll start with you. What question do you have for Sid and Nick?
Yeah, so I actually want to ask Sid and Nick about the branch of government that we have not talked about at all yet. I want to ask a little bit about how the federal courts, particularly in the current moment, fit into this story. So right now we have the status quo where Congress has delegated an enormous amount of power to the executive. The executive branch has also asserted more power that is difficult for Congress to claw back. But we also, in this moment, have this attack via the courts on some elements of the administrative state. And so I'm thinking here particularly about the efforts to undermine Chevron deference, arguments about what agencies can and can't do under the non-delegation doctrine. So sort of given the story that your book tells us, what would our presidency-centered politics look like with this weaker administrative state that some are worried we're sort of headed for, given this line of court cases and challenges?
If we had a weaker administrative state, what would that look like? That's a great question. When I was reading about the legal issues, Bali, regarding President Biden's vaccine mandate, there were a couple of ways to go. One was the way the court went, which was to say OSHA did not have this power. But there's a lot of push now in the conservative movement, and particularly coming out of the conservative legal movement, to argue that the very creation of OSHA was a violation was a violation of the Constitution, because Congress was delegating its legislative responsibility to OSHA. And I think if it went that far, it would be a problem. I think we learned during the pandemic that expertise can be very valuable. Neutral competence, as it's sometimes put by defenders of the bureaucracy, can be a really central, important part of a representative government. So I think the task is not to eliminate the administrative state or deconstruct it to completely politicize it. I think the task is not to try to delegate everything to it. And I think, in the best of all worlds, back in the Roosevelt days, perhaps it was necessary to have some kind of vaccine mandate, but it would have been good to have a law giving the federal government, OSHA, or another agency, HHS, Health and Human Services, the responsibility to carry out that mandate.
And Justice Breyer was really known for that approach. So,
yeah,
I think maybe a litmus test here, Sid, is will Biden pick someone that has that in their experience on the federal bench, if he ends up picking a federal judge to go to the court to become the ninth justice, someone that has had that kind of deference for expertise, or somebody that's more activist in a sense of looking to outcomes?
Yeah, it's a great question. I hope it's a consideration.
I was quite struck by Lindsey Graham coming out proactively arguing on behalf of somebody that actually might fit that mold, which was quite interesting.
But that perspective will still be in the minority.
Yep.
And Molly, your great question has me thinking about how much the role of the judiciary, how politicized the judiciary and judicial appointments have become during presidential campaigns. You know, not just Nixon in 1968 saying, I am going to restore the legitimacy of the court, but all the way to Donald Trump holding a list of Federalist Society approved judges saying, if you pick me, you'll be guaranteed our people will be on the court. You know, how does the court maintain the cult of the robe, its legitimacy, when it's dragged so deeply into partisan contests that center on the presidency? I don't know.
And Trump gave the Christian right activists a list of people he would appoint, he was going to consider if he was elected president.
All right, Ron, your question.
So, gentlemen, I'm quite curious, looking at the rise of the use of the executive order. Certainly, this is something that's gone all the way back to the first president and something that's exercised presently by the 46th. But as you both know, an executive order gives the president a lot of deference and a lot of leeway to sort of get some of the policy initiatives put into place that otherwise wouldn't go through a very fractured Congress, giving them extraordinary power. And I wonder, is there a way, in your respective opinions, that Congress can sort of reassert power? Obviously, they could pass legislation, but why would the president sign that into law? They'd veto it. So, a way for Congress to sort of try to get a snapback to get some more power back towards the legislative and away from the executive branch.
You want to go first this time, Nick?
Sure.
I mean, I'm happy to do it.
It's a wonderful question, and you've confronted two presidency scholars that are thinking about reforms in Congress. So, you know, you mentioned executive orders. I think those are the flashiest moments, right? We have images of our past two presidents on their inauguration day, holding up executive orders, things that they're doing right in the moment. You also have all these more minor administrative decisions that the presidents and then the president's appointees in these agencies carry out through memoranda, rules, my favorite, the dear colleague letters. You receive federal funding and we're going to kindly ask that you do this as a result. Some of this, no doubt, goes back to some of the statutory holes or the loose statutory language that both Molly and Sid were picking up on, and how now the courts are responsible for adjudicating what the president can and can't do as a result of this sort of sloppy statutory language, which permits these administrative decisions. We write in the book, so I'll say we, although I really dive into this maybe more than Sid. I think OIRA should be scaled back, the office within the Office of Management and Budget that oversees all regulatory reform and creates a regulatory agenda for the presidency. Congress used to have oversight over the regulatory agenda. Administration and regulation is nothing new. It goes back to the founding. The Continental Congress had an administrative state, but members of Congress had oversight on it. They didn't delegate that out to the presidency. Sid, anything you would do?
Yeah, I think it would be useful, and some of our colleagues have talked about this, for Congress to pass some legislation that would constrain the president's emergency powers. I mean, that 1976 piece of legislation, for example, as we learned, is a pretty fragile way for Congress to control emergency, since the president can veto an attempt by Congress to repeal the emergency action. And some of our colleagues have suggested a law that would establish that would allow that if Congress that would stipulate that if Congress didn't take action approving the emergency action within 30 days, then the emergency action would not hold up. I think that some kind of legislation like that, Ron, would really be helpful. More broadly, I want to go back to a point Molly made about the Gingrich reforms after the Republicans took control of Congress in 1994, which really weakened the committee system, which really transformed what were some pretty strong institutional loyalties in Congress into strictly partisan loyalties. And I think congressional oversight is probably, and broad institutional oversight is the best way to rein in this presidential unilateralism. Now, how feasible that is, Ron and Molly, you probably know better than I. But I think that has been a real. I mentioned the 1946 Legislative Reorganization Act as a critical prop against presidentialism, and it's been weakened considerably.
Great question. Okay, so we've now entered the fourth quarter, and we're going to start going to questions from the audience. I think this is a terrific question. Gary Donato asked, and by the way, I used to think, oh no, it's a canard, but I actually think really important. For those focusing on congressional processes, how can we as a nation get back to clean, more simplistic bills rather than these massive 1,000 to 2,000 page bills, which few actually read? Do these huge bills contribute to the problem? And also lead to America's anger and exacerbate both inter and intra-party turmoil? Is the bill too big?
Are we talking about the Build Back Better bill?
As a general matter, are these bills too big?
I think we're all, we can all answer these questions, right? Everybody's participating in the fourth quarter.
Yeah, in fact, why don't we, I'll do my best, Margaret.
We might have to go into overtime.
I'll do my best, Margaret Brennan, even though she's smarter than me, she's better than me, she's much better to look at than me. If you guys would each go to 2 minutes for each of these questions, I think we can get a few of them in.
Yeah, I'll say quickly, I think it's a huge problem. I think it's a great question. And I think the pathologies of this were demonstrated by the battle over the Build Back Better bill. It's just a bill with every progressive wish in the bill and so full of stuff, so opaque that all that was talked about, all that was debated was how much money was being spent. And it's a real interesting question as to why the Democrats didn't break that down into more manageable bills. For example, why not go after the trial credit bill first, independently, which had some support among conservatives. Mitt Romney, for example, has expressed interest because it's pro-family in the child credit. And I just say quickly, one of the reasons that won't happen takes us back to movement politics and the power that the base has over the parties. The base can't agree among itself because they all have the base is diverse, a coalition and each part of the coalition expresses different causes. The base itself couldn't figure out what it should push as a priority. And so there was resistance from the climate change people to just focus on those issues related to family security. So I think the problems are deep, but I agree, Bill, it's a really important question.
Anybody else want to tackle that, or does everybody agree? Molly, do you want to get in there?
So I'll just say two things. One is not to make this a sort of when all you have is a hammer, everything you see is a nail answer. But part of the answer to Sid's question about sort of why one big bill and not multiple little bills is the realities of of congressional rules and the realities of the rules around the reconciliation process and the number of times that Congress can kind of go to that well, which allows it to legislate without the threat of a filibuster. And so there is sort of a procedural story here. But one thing I want to say about kind of big omnibus bills that really speaks to what Sid and Nick were saying with the last question from Ron, it's to my mind, one of the big challenges of omnibus legislating is it actually makes it harder for Congress to pick individual fights with the executive branch. And so we see this particularly in the appropriations context. When Congress ends up doing one big spending bill, if they are going to be in conflict with the president over something, and they're going to threaten not to pass that spending bill, that means you're shutting down virtually all of the federal government as opposed to sort of one individual agency. And it just, it makes it much more difficult for Congress to exert its appropriations power over the executive branch.
Anybody else want to get in on that one? I wanted to marry up one other piece of that and maybe get a second comment before going to the next question. We've done a lot of studies of first years at the Miller Center, presidential first years, and one of the things that's come out of it for me is essentially if we get into a cycle where presidents come in with Congress controlled by, oftentimes Trump had it, Biden had it, Obama had it, Bush had it for 6 months, Clinton had it, at least in the last set of presidents. You get this one shot when you control both houses of Congress. And I'm wondering if the 1,000-page bills is simply, and the realization that Lyndon Johnson had, which is you get 1 year, and after that, Congress is thinking about the midterm and almost certainly going to lose one house of Congress. So you get 1 year where you want to get a lot of things done. And it's, to what Molly said, it's easier to get it done once rather than 15 times. All right, so to the next question from Terry Newell, and I touched on this a bit before, but I'd love your all comments on this. After Vietnam and Watergate, America's trust in government plummeted and has never fully recovered. What would it take to reverse the distrust? How do we get people willing to trust government again?
Well, look, in my experience in this, working with an organization called Unite America, as well as No Labels, you have to start treating people as people. Not, I am going to legislate on behalf of fill in the blank group, right? And the real hatred that I think that a lot of members have for those on the other side of the fence is something that you've got to step back from the abyss. It's so much easier. And I remember watching this when the Republicans took over in 1995 of, we ran against Washington, right? Send your families back home. Don't live here in Washington. Washington's evil. Washington's terrible. And it's so much easier to demonize people who you don't know, who you don't really socialize with, as opposed that you do know and that you do socialize with. And there has to be sort of a white flag of truce, and that these legislators need to sit down with each other as well as with the president. I mean, I just remember so many times that President Bush would bring in Senator Kennedy or, fill in the blank Democrats just to sit on the Truman balcony and just to chat. And it doesn't seem like anybody wants to chat anymore. It seems like people want to go back to their respective battle lines and then start firing cannons.
And forbid that a senator or a representative gets their photograph taken dining with Biden at the White House. I mean, that's a primary ad already written.
Yep.
I want to go back. Molly spoke about expectations and promises being unfulfilled. And I think a lot of the ratcheting up of expectations has to do with how centered our politics is on the presidency. I don't know how to overcome that. But one thing in finishing out this book that we became very interested in was, even though we are so deeply divided, and even though our elections, the last two in particular, have been so contentious, 4 in 10 Americans aren't showing up.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm becoming very interested in that group that tends to always get dropped from the polls and dropped from the surveys because they're not in our likely voter models. But if we could bring those voices back in, those that are so disgusted with the way our politics is being played out, their votes, their voters that either of the two parties could potentially capture.
Let me ask a question about that, Nick. Do we know, for people that stay at home, do we know that they tend to be more civil, more moderate, more of a vital center? Or do we think that what really gets them to vote is to activate them more and to appeal to them in more populist ways? I think one thing that we've seen is big turnout in the last 2 elections because people were really agitated because they think the people on the other side, I won't use the expletive, are going to screw them over.
I think big turnout, but relative to really, really poor turnout, which is still, in a comparison of other industrialized democracies, low turnout. I don't think they're more civil. We know that political independents are less interested, less knowledgeable about politics. One thing we write about is the transfer of power as a result of these reforms in Congress, in the party system, from individuals who used to know that politics was about power. Politics was about, this is a colleague, Eaton Hirsch at Boston College, like politics was about doing work and not just symbolic gesturing. I think a lot of people are interested in politics for the symbolic gesturing, and that turns out people that might, I'm not sure, but might be a part of that vital center.
Mhm. All right, we've got about 4 minutes left here. A quick question from Alan Stam, a colleague of ours at UVA and at the Miller Center. Following the logic of Duncan Black and Anthony Downs, the two parties purging their ranks of people in the center is regrettable but understandable. The loss of the New England Liberal Republican, the Southern Conservative Democrat. Any ideas for how the two parties might become less rather than more extreme?
I think if I had good ideas on that question, someone would pay me a lot more money to do something else than what I do right now. I mean, it's one of the greatest, I think, and how to get Congress to legislate effectively given the polarization of the parties is one of the greatest challenges, I think, of certainly for Congress of the current moment. And obviously, there are divisions within the parties, but they pale in comparison to the division between the parties, at least in the legislature, and figuring out how to incentivize members to work together despite those large partisan differences really is a challenge that I don't have great answers to, and it certainly contributes to a number of the pathologies that we've talked about earlier today.
Yeah, I think Alan's point is really well taken, Bill. We're not going to go back to the catch-all parties of the 1950s. We have a much more of a national programmatic party system now. But again, Nick and I keep going back to our presidentialism. By the end of this fourth quarter, we're able to say it again.
You might be able to say it. I'm not sure I can.
You know, one thing's figuring out a way to strengthen party organizations is more national than they were prior to the McGovern-Fraser reforms in the 1970s. So there is a sense of collective responsibility rather than centering so much on the presidency would help. The original party system was founded during the Jacksonian period when Jackson was a real populist threat to constitutional norms. Henry Clay called him the Napoleon of America. The purpose was to transform, as Martin Van Buren, one of the architects of the party system, put it, personal preference into party principles. And we've got to figure out a way to strengthen the collective responsibility of the party. So there is a sense of what conservatives stand for and what liberals stand for. I think we're going to have that more clear choice than we've had previously in American history. But it all can't fall to the personal ambition of the presidency. The presidency sets up such a winner-take-all system, you know. Mm-hmm. So I think one of the things we need to do is figure out a way to engage the presidency more with the Congress and engage the presidency more with the states, I believe.
Just, we had a minute. Just on that note, I do think there is a glimmer of hope. I have in my mind a bill being co-sponsored by Adam Schiff right now. It doesn't take on everything Sid and I write about with the growth of unilateralism and presidentialism, but even small things such as setting curbs on whether or not a president can fire inspectors general, a thing that both Biden and Trump, an act that they benefited from, limiting the number of acting appointments, limiting the amount of declarations of emergencies they can declare, which gives them much more latitude to move pots of monies from one program or another. These are small ways to, as Molly said, incentivize presidents to act differently and hopefully engage with members of Congress a little bit more.
That's really great, Nick. Well, we are at the appointed hour. My last question was going to be, do foreign threats help? I was struck since Margaret Brennan is my Sunday morning partner and watched Lindsey Graham. And on 3 different issues, Lindsey Graham was agreeing with Joe Biden. One was rewriting the Electoral College Act. 2 was that there was a Supreme Court justice he could support. And 3 was President Biden's response to what's going on in Russia. My last question was, did we have this vital center in the Cold War period because the foreign threat was so great. So maybe for our next conversation around the lunch table when we can all be back in Charlottesville, Molly, we can't wait to bring you down. Great to have everybody. I really want to thank the audience for joining us today. And most importantly, want to thank Sid and Nick for this terrific book, and Ron and Molly for joining in the conversation.
Yeah, I want to just thank Molly and Ron for honoring us with their presence. It's great to have you guys with us today.
Thank you both, and congratulations once again on what I think is a great book that a lot of people will enjoy, but learn a great deal from.
What Ron said. Thanks for having me. I think the book is terrific, and I recommend it to the audience.
Great. And thanks, of course, to our Miller Center team who puts these events together. Christina, Rob, Kevin, Howard, and Mike in particular on this event. And for all of you out there for joining us each week. You have kept our life fun during the pandemic by creating this community that we've so benefited from. So with that, we'll see you at our next webinar, which I think is next week.
Thank you, Bill.